They thought they could break me by breaking my mailbox. What they didn't know is, I've spent my whole life building things that don't fall.
The small town of Maple Creek looked picture perfect on the outside. White fences stretched along emerald lawns. Children rode bicycles under tall oak trees, and the Homeowners Association claimed it was the safest place to live in America. But behind the polished image, cracks ran deep, cracks that one man was about to expose. That man was Darnell Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered black rancher with calloused hands and a heart full of patience. Darnell had lived on the edge of Maple Creek for 10 years. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He simply minded his land, cared for his horses, and looked after his widowed mother. But in Maple Creek, simply existing as different made you stand out. And sometimes, stand out in the worst way possible. It all began with something as small as a mailbox. Darnell's mailbox sat at the end of his gravel driveway, a sturdy wooden post with a simple black box on top. Nothing fancy, yet for some reason, every few weeks, his mailbox was found crushed, tilted, or snapped in half. Sometimes it looked like an accident, sometimes it was obvious vandalism. And while neighbors' mailboxes stood untouched, Darnell's kept ending up destroyed. At first, he brushed it off. He replaced the post. He laughed when his mother joked that the mailbox had worse luck than a glass vase in an earthquake. But when it kept happening, and always late at night, Darnell started watching more closely. One evening, just after sunset, Darnell sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. That's when he heard the low rumble of an engine creeping down the street. Headlights flashed, swerved slightly, and then crunch. His mailbox shattered again under the bumper of a black SUV. The vehicle slowed, just enough for him to see the emblem on the side, the HOA's private neighborhood patrol. They weren't real police officers. They were volunteers, mostly wealthy residents, who drove around in SUVs with flashing lights, giving themselves the power to enforce order. But everyone in town called them the HOA cops. And somehow, his mailbox was always in their way. Darnell's chest tightened with frustration. He wanted to shout, to confront them, but he knew exactly how that would end, with more blame falling on him. In Maple Creek, the word of an HOA officer was law, and his word, well, it didn't carry much weight. But Darnell wasn't about to let them win. Not this time. He had been underestimated before, and every time, he found a way to rise above it. That night, under the moonlight, he stood at the wrecked pile of wood and bent metal, and a quiet resolve spread across his face. His neighbors might have seen just a broken mailbox, but Darnell saw an opportunity to turn the tables. Little did Maple Creek know, the man they thought was just a rancher had a background no one expected. And the next mailbox he built would change everything. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Told you weren't good enough? Or maybe, like Darnell, treated unfairly just for who you are? If you know that feeling, stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And if stories like this inspire you, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss these powerful life lessons. Now, let's meet the villain of our story. The next morning, Darnell swept the splinters of his mailbox into a pile, his jaw tight but his movements calm. He didn't have to wonder who did it. The answer was parked 3 houses down, polished to a shine. The black SUV, leaning against it, sunglasses perched on his nose, was Gregory Whitman, head of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association patrol. He wasn't a real cop, though you'd never guess it from the way he strutted around. He wore a navy polo with a stitched-on badge, carried a clipboard like it was a weapon, and spoke as if the whole neighborhood had to answer to him. "Morning. Darnell," Gregory called out, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Mailbox didn't hold up again, huh? Shame. You know, if you kept it closer to regulation height, accidents like this wouldn't keep happening." Darnell said nothing. He just kept sweeping. Gregory smirked. He thrived on silence, and it made him feel like he'd won. You see, this is exactly why the HOA patrol exists, to keep order. Some folks around here, well, let's just say they don't quite fit the Maple Creek standard. Not their fault, of course. They just need a little guidance. The words landed heavy. coded but sharp. Everyone knew what Gregory meant. To him, Darnell wasn't Maple Creek standard. He wasn't one of the golf course fathers or the country club members. He didn't blend in, and Gregory made sure he felt it. Neighbors passed by, pretending not to hear. Some nodded politely at Gregory while avoiding Darnell's eyes. That was the unspoken rule: stay on Gregory's good side or risk becoming his next target. Gregory prided himself on being untouchable. He was the type of man who parked diagonally across two spaces at the grocery store, then lectured others about community responsibility. He bragged about his influence on the HOA board, about how his patrol kept Maple Creek safe, and about how his family had lived in the neighborhood since the beginning, and he especially enjoyed mocking Darnell. One evening at the local diner, Gregory had loudly joked to his friends, maybe Darnell should stop wasting wood on mailboxes and just put up a cardboard box. At least then, when it gets knocked down, it'll match the rest of his rustic lifestyle. The table erupted in laughter. Darnell, sitting a few stools away, kept his eyes on his plate. But inside, a fire simmered. Gregory believed he was in control, the kind of control that comes from arrogance mixed with privilege. He saw himself as the gatekeeper of Maple Creek, the man who could decide who belonged and who didn't. And the sight of Darnell's smashed mailbox, night after night, was just another way for him to flex that power. But Gregory had no idea who he was really dealing with. He thought Darnell was a quiet rancher with nothing more than muscles and haystacks. What he didn't know was that Darnell's past carried secrets that would turn the entire town's perception upside down, and soon, Gregory's arrogance would cost him everything. For the next week, Darnell quietly rebuilt his mailbox. Neighbors driving past saw him out by the road, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. To them, it looked like routine repair, the defeated chore of a man too stubborn to complain. But if they had looked closer, they would have noticed something different this time. The careful measuring, the way he studied the ground, tapped the soil, and checked levels with unusual precision. This wasn't just a mailbox rebuild. It was something else, something more deliberate. Darnell had a gift, though most in Maple Creek had never bothered to ask. Before moving to the ranch, before taking care of his mother, before settling into this quiet corner of life, Darnell had lived a very different existence. As a child, he had grown up in a tough part of Atlanta where nothing came easy. His father worked long hours as a construction foreman, and young Darnell often followed him to job sites, watching and learning. By age 12, he could handle power tools better than most grown men. By 15, he was sketching designs in notebooks, bridges, sheds, and even reinforced barriers, not because anyone asked him to, but because he loved the challenge of making things strong, unbreakable. His mother used to say, "Son, the world might try to break you, but you've got a builder's soul. You'll always find a way to hold things together." When his father passed away suddenly, Darnell stepped up. He worked odd jobs in carpentry, welding, and mechanics, eventually paying his way through a technical program in structural engineering. He had a diploma, a portfolio of projects, and even an offer from a big construction firm. But when his mother's health began to decline, he turned it all down to move her out of the city, onto the peaceful ranch she loved. Most people in Maple Creek only saw the quiet rancher who rode horses and mended fences. They never guessed he could draft blueprints or calculate stress loads in his head. They never guessed that behind his easygoing smile lay years of grit, study, and skill. That was the mistake Gregory made. As Gregory bragged to his HOA friends about teaching the rancher a lesson, Darnell was in his barn late at night, sketching designs under a single dangling light bulb. Sawdust floated in the air, sparks flashed from his welding torch, and the sound of steel meeting steel echoed into the still night. It wasn't anger driving him. It wasn't revenge either. It was purpose. Every slam of Gregory's SUV against that mailbox had been a challenge, and Darnell had finally decided to answer. He thought back to the time his father had taken him to a construction site where they were building a highway barrier. "This wall," his father had said, slapping the concrete with pride, "isn't just about strength. It's about respect. When people see something built to last, they think twice before testing it. Those words stuck with him, and now they guided his hands. Meanwhile, whispers floated around town. Some neighbors wondered why Darnell's barn light never seemed to go out. Others speculated he was fixing tractors or building new stables. No one knew he was crafting something that would soon make the entire neighborhood stop and stare. Even his mother noticed the shift. One night, she peeked into the barn and saw blueprints spread across the table. "Darnell," she asked gently, "you planning to build a house out there?" He chuckled softly, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not a house, Mama, just a message." Her brow furrowed. "A message?" He kissed her forehead, his voice calm but certain. "Yeah, the kind that doesn't need words." Back on the street, Gregory and his patrol had no idea what was coming. To them, Darnell was still just the quiet outsider they could push around. They saw his patience as weakness. They mistook his silence for submission. But in reality, that silence was strategy. Because when the night finally came for Gregory's SUV to take its usual late turn past Darnell's driveway, the patrol wouldn't be hitting another flimsy wooden post. No, this time they'd be colliding with a creation built by hands trained in strength, discipline, and resilience. And when it happened, Maple Creek would never look at Darnell the same way again. The night was still. Maple Creek slept beneath a velvet sky, porch lights flickering out one by one as families drifted into dreams. But at the end of the gravel driveway, a brand new mailbox stood like a sentinel, taller, stronger, and strangely imposing. On the surface, it looked simple. A sleek black box sat atop a polished wooden post, but anyone with an eye for detail would have noticed the faint gleam at its base, the way it stood straighter than any other mailbox on the block, the way the ground beneath it had been freshly tamped and reinforced. Inside, Darnell's heart was steady. He sat on his porch chair sipping coffee just like before, only this time he wasn't waiting in frustration. He was waiting with certainty, and sure enough, the familiar rumble broke the silence. Headlights swept around the corner. A black SUV rolled slowly down the street, its high beams bouncing across the lawns. Behind the wheel, Gregory Whitman smirked, a cigar clenched between his teeth. Beside him sat two other HOA patrol members chuckling about their late-night rounds. "There it is," Gregory said, spotting the fresh mailbox. "Man just doesn't learn, does he?" "What is this, the fifth one?" "Sixth," one of his buddies laughed. "Guy must have a whole forest just for mailboxes." Gregory revved the engine. "Well, let's see how long this one lasts." The SUV swerved. Tires crunched against gravel. In a practiced motion, Gregory aimed the bumper square at the mailbox and floored the gas. What happened next silenced the entire vehicle. Instead of splintering into shards, the mailbox barely budged. The SUV shuddered violently as though it had struck a wall. The cigar flew out of Gregory's mouth. His friend's laughter turned into stunned gasps. Metal groaned. Headlights flickered and the hood of the SUV crumpled inward with a sickening crunch. The mailbox, still standing. Not a dent, not a tilt. Just there, proud and unbroken. Gregory slammed the brakes, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. What is this thing?" he barked, his voice cracking. The passenger opened his door and staggered out, clutching his knee. He walked up to the mailbox, tapped it, then recoiled. "Greg, this ain't wood. This thing's solid. Feels like steel or something." From his porch, Darnell rose slowly. His shadow stretched long under the moonlight. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply walked down the steps, each footfall calm, deliberate, echoing across the night air. Gregory swallowed hard, but forced a laugh, trying to mask his fear. "What did you do, Carter? Cement this thing into the earth?" Darnell stopped at the edge of his driveway. His eyes met Gregory's. For a long moment, silence hung heavy, a silence louder than shouting. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and measured. "I built it to last." The words cut sharper than any insult. They weren't angry. They weren't boastful. They were fact, unshakable, undeniable. Neighbors, awakened by the crash, began stepping out onto porches. One by one, doors opened, lights flicked on. Curious eyes peered out at the scene. The once cocky Gregory standing beside his dented SUV, and Darnell, calm as stone, beside an unscathed mailbox. Whispers rose in the crowd. How's it still standing? He must have built it different. Never seen anything like it. Gregory felt the weight of their stares. For the first time, the power he had wielded so smugly began to slip. Desperate, he barked at Darnell. "This isn't regulation, HOA rules say." But Darnell cut him off with a quiet firmness that carried farther than any yell. HOA rules didn't build this. I did, with my hands, with my father's teachings, with respect for what lasts. The crowd murmured louder. Some nodded. Others folded their arms, realizing that the man they had underestimated was far more than they had imagined. Gregory's SUV hissed as steam rose from its crushed hood. His patrol buddies shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. And then the unthinkable happened. Applause. It started soft, one clap from an older neighbor at the end of the block. Then another. Then a wave of clapping rolled through the street as people, long silent under Gregory's arrogance, finally voiced their support, not through words, but through recognition of strength, resilience, and dignity. Gregory's face flushed crimson. He wanted to shout, to order everyone back inside, to regain control, but the sound of that applause drowned him out. For once, he was powerless. Darnell didn't raise his arms in victory. He didn't gloat. He simply turned, walked back up to his porch, and sat down again, coffee in hand, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone watching knew. Something extraordinary had happened. The mailbox wasn't just a mailbox. It was a symbol, a statement, proof that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands unshaken. And while Gregory's SUV sat broken in the middle of the street, Darnell's creation stood tall, a monument to quiet defiance, crafted with patience, skill, and an unyielding spirit. The tide in Maple Creek had begun to turn, but little did the town know. This was only the beginning, because hidden within Darnell's creation was a secret no one, not even Gregory, could have predicted. The following morning, Maple Creek buzzed with gossip. At the coffee shop, at the gas station, even at the elementary school pickup line, the same question circled, how did Darnell build that thing? Some said it was solid concrete. Others whispered it was military-grade steel. A few even joked that he had buried an anchor in the ground. But no one knew the truth. Not yet. By noon, Gregory Whitman had filed a formal HOA complaint. He stormed into the neighborhood board meeting, slamming photos of his dented SUV on the table. "This man," Gregory barked, "is a menace. He's installed a mailbox that's a danger to vehicles. This isn't regulation, it's a fortress. We demand immediate removal." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. For years, they had nodded along to Gregory's bluster. But after last night's spectacle, even they weren't so sure. Finally, one cleared his throat. "Maybe we should hear from Mr. Carter first." And so, later that evening, Darnell received the summons. Appear before the HOA board to explain himself. The meeting was packed. Neighbors filled every chair, the hallway, even pressed against the windows. Everyone wanted to hear what the quiet rancher had to say. Gregory stood at the front, puffed up like a rooster, certain he'd win back his authority. "Well, Carter," he sneered, "why don't you tell everyone exactly what you built out there?" Darnell rose from his seat. He carried a folder under his arm, and when he opened it, he spread out neatly drawn blueprints across the table. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "This isn't just a mailbox," Darnell said, his voice calm but firm. "It's a design I drafted years ago, back when I studied structural engineering. It's built with reinforced steel, set in a concrete foundation, and tested to withstand thousands of pounds of force." Gregory scoffed. "So you're telling us you turned your mailbox into—" "What, a bunker?" Darnell shook his head. "I turned it into a message. You see, I've built things before, real things. I worked on highway barriers, city bridges, and support beams meant to save lives. I didn't advertise it because I don't need recognition. But last night proved something. When people try to destroy what you've built, you don't crumble. You stand." The room fell silent. For the first time, many realized they knew almost nothing about the man they had judged from afar. And then came the revelation that made jaws drop. Darnell pulled out a certificate, laminated and official, stamped with the state seal. For years, I worked as a licensed structural engineer. The same skills that built that mailbox built infrastructure that keeps thousands of people safe every single day. What you saw last night wasn't luck. It was design, precision, dedication. Murmurs exploded. A woman whispered, "He's an engineer?" Another said, "All this time." Gregory's face drained of color. His whole campaign against Darnell had been built on the idea that he was just some uneducated rancher who didn't belong. And now, in front of everyone, that illusion shattered. But Darnell wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "And here's the real twist, Gregory. You keep saying my mailbox isn't regulation. But according to county law, everything I built meets and exceeds safety codes. In fact, it's safer than the flimsy wooden posts most of you have. Safer for mail carriers, safer for the road, safer for the whole neighborhood." He slid a copy of the county guidelines across the table. Highlighted sections glowed under the fluorescent lights. He had receipts. He had proof. The HOA board studied the papers, nodding slowly. One by one, their expressions shifted from doubt to respect. The crowd erupted in applause again, louder this time. Some even stood to their feet, clapping and cheering. Gregory, red-faced and sweating, tried to interject. But this isn't fair. He made us look like fools." Darnell turned to him, his gaze steady. "No, Gregory. You did that yourself. You thought breaking me down would make you stronger. Instead, you just revealed your weakness. And now everyone sees it." The board chair finally spoke, her voice firm. "Mr. Carter's mailbox will remain. In fact, perhaps the rest of us could learn a thing or two from his craftsmanship." The room roared with approval. Gregory stumbled back, his authority crumbling in real time. What had started as a broken mailbox had transformed into a revelation. Darnell wasn't just a rancher. He was a builder, a protector, a man of quiet strength whose skills had been underestimated for far too long, and Maple Creek would never look at him the same way again. From that night on, Gregory Whitman's grip on Maple Creek unraveled faster than anyone could have imagined. The man who once strutted around with sunglasses and a clipboard suddenly found doors closing in his face. Neighbors who used to nod politely now crossed the street to avoid him. The same people who once laughed at his jokes in the diner now whispered behind his back. The dented black SUV sat in his driveway like a scar he couldn't cover. Every time he turned the key, the engine rattled in protest, reminding him of the mailbox that hadn't moved an inch. And the HOA board? They didn't just dismiss his complaint, they began questioning his leadership entirely. At the next meeting, one board member said flatly, "Gregory, perhaps it's time for new direction." Another added, "We can't enforce rules by intimidation. We need fairness, respect." Gregory's face flushed. He tried to bark orders like he always had, but this time, no one listened. His voice, once booming with false authority, now rang hollow. Words spread even faster online. Someone had filmed the moment Gregory's SUV crumpled against Darnell's mailbox. Within days, the clip went viral on social media. HOA bully meets unbreakable. "Mailbox!" Comments poured in from strangers, who had never heard of Maple Creek, but knew exactly the type of man Gregory represented. He got what he deserved. Classic case of karma. That mailbox has more backbone than the HOA cop. For the first time, Gregory wasn't feared or admired. He was ridiculed. The final blow came quietly. His so-called patrol team, the neighbors who used to ride along with him at night, stopped showing up. One by one, they slipped away, embarrassed to be associated with him. Without his entourage, without the illusion of power, Gregory was just another man, exposed, diminished, and forgotten. And every morning, when he drove past Darnell's driveway, his stomach churned, because there it was, the mailbox. Tall, unyielding, a daily reminder of his arrogance. For Darnell, it wasn't about revenge. He didn't smile when Gregory's empire collapsed, nor did he celebrate his humiliation. He simply kept living, tending to his ranch, caring for his mother, and sipping his morning coffee on the porch. But for Maple Creek, Gregory's downfall marked a turning point. The man who had bullied, mocked, and intimidated his way to power was no longer in control. His empire of arrogance had crumbled, all because he underestimated the quiet strength of one man who chose to stand. After Gregory's downfall, the atmosphere in Maple Creek shifted like the first warm breeze after a long winter. Where there had once been fear of speaking up, now there was conversation. Neighbors who used to keep their heads down began waving at each other more. Parents lingered at the bus stop, chatting instead of retreating behind doors. The tension that Gregory had fed for years began to dissolve, and at the center of it all was the unshakable mailbox. It became more than just a steel and concrete structure. It became a landmark. People stopped to look at it, some even snapping photos. Joggers slowed down to pat its post like a good luck charm. Mail carriers delivered letters with a smile, whispering, "Safest box in town." But what struck the neighborhood most wasn't the mailbox itself, it was the man who built it. For the first time, many neighbors approached Darnell not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. They asked about his engineering background, his projects in the city, even his late-night welding sessions. Some came by to apologize for years of silence. Others came to ask for advice on building things stronger, safer, better. One afternoon, a young boy from down the street biked up the gravel driveway. He looked nervous, clutching a worn sketchbook. "Mr. Carter," he said shyly, "I like to draw buildings too. Do you think I could learn from you?" Darnell smiled, his eyes softening. "Of course, son. Bring your sketches by any time. We'll build something together." Word of that exchange spread quickly, and soon Darnell found himself mentoring kids from the neighborhood, teaching them basics of carpentry, design, and resilience. His barn, once just a workshop, became a small hub of learning, not formal classes, but quiet lessons about patience, craftsmanship, and pride in building something that lasts. The HOA board, humbled by the public's support for Darnell, took action too. They rewrote certain rules, replacing vague, biased guidelines with clear, fair standards. The so-called patrol was dissolved permanently. In its place, they formed a community committee that encouraged cooperation instead of intimidation. And when they needed someone to advise on safety codes for neighborhood projects, they turned to none other than Darnell Carter. At first, he declined. "I'm not interested in politics," he said. But when the board chair explained that it wasn't about power, but about making the neighborhood safer and stronger for everyone, he agreed to lend his expertise. Soon, neighbors were working together in ways they never had before. Broken fences were mended not with fines and warnings, but with volunteer crews. Kids painted murals on the community center. And when someone joked about replacing their own mailbox with a Carter special, the entire room laughed, not at Darnell, but with him. Through it all, Darnell stayed humble. He didn't brag about his victory, nor did he rub Gregory's nose in defeat. Instead, he let his actions speak, steady, grounded, and resilient. His mother, sitting on the porch beside him one evening, patted his hand. "You see, son? Your father was right. Builders hold things together, not just wood and steel, but people too." Darnell looked at the mailbox, standing tall in the fading light. For years, it had been a symbol of destruction and frustration. Now it stood as a beacon of strength, community, and respect. Maple Creek had changed, not because one man shouted the loudest, but because one man chose to stand steady, to build rather than break, to rise instead of bend, and in that quiet triumph, the entire town learned a lesson they would never forget. In the end, the story of Darnell Carter wasn't really about a mailbox. It was about resilience, about what happens when a person refuses to let arrogance and prejudice tear them down, about how quiet strength can outlast the loudest voices. Darnell didn't fight back with fists or anger. He didn't stoop to Gregory's level. He chose to build, to create, to let his work, his patience, his skill, his dignity, speak louder than any insult ever could. And in doing so, he not only defended himself, but he transformed his community. He reminded everyone that true power isn't about control or intimidation. True power is the ability to inspire change, to leave something standing long after the noise fades away. Maybe you've faced your own Gregorys in life, people who underestimated you, mocked you, or tried to break you down. Remember Darnell's lesson. You don't always have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the strongest statement you can make is to stand unshaken, to keep building, to keep moving forward. Because when you do, the world takes notice, and change follows. Strength isn't about destruction. It's about resilience, dignity, and building something that lasts. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. And remember, no matter what challenges you face, stand tall. Build strong, live with respect.